Chapter 20. The Garden of Stars. Years had a soft way of passing in Waverly Bay, like the tide that moved in and out without announcing itself. And the little hill where the greenhouse stood learned each season with patient attention, until even the wood of the door seemed to carry the memory of every hand that had turned its handle. After the evening when Aiden and Mira read the letters they had kept close and placed them in the drawer with the other small treasures, life settled into a steady glow that did not call attention to itself. The lantern on their cottage table still learned the shape of each night and offered warm light to haven and horizon, and the two windows continued their quiet conversation with the town and the sea. Work continued too, one gentle task after another, and yet something in their days began to widen, as if the room of their life had been opened to make space for chairs that had been waiting. People who visited the hill for seedlings or advice about a cutting began to linger, at first for a few minutes after a question, then for an hour, then for an evening when the sky turned pale and the first stars came out like tiny lamps. Someone brought a chair and left it by accident. Someone else brought a low table. A friend contributed a row of hooks for coats. The librarian arrived with a crate of books that carried quiet stories inside their spines. The station attendant brought a set of small stools that had once lived in a ticket office and still knew how to keep good posture. The widow from the market carried up a basket of herbs and a promise to refill it as needed. The boy who had outgrown his red mittens painted a sign that said simply rest and set it above the door with a small smile that made the letters look as if they were breathing. No one declared an opening date. Nothing grand was planned. It happened as a plant happens, with a small push at the right time and a little help once a week and a sturdy belief that roots know what to do. By the time spring returned with clear light and the gentle salt of warmer air, the greenhouse had become more than a room where plants learned to live. It had become a small community space, a calm place to pause, a shelter whose roof had once been repaired by many hands and now carried that history like a good story told at the end of the day. Aiden and Mira did not change who they were to meet this new life. They stayed themselves, the careful illustrator who loved to watch ordinary things reveal their beauty, and the bright botanist whose hands could coax stubborn roots to accept a new home without losing courage. Together they made tea for whoever came up the path. Together they showed children how to press leaves into paper without bruising them. Together they listened when a neighbor needed to speak with no solution required. Together they steadied the room just by being in it and by letting others be in it too. Each evening, when the light above the ridge softened and the glass panes turned from clear to violet and then to a tender dark, they lit the greenhouse lantern and set it in the center so that older eyes could see to read and younger eyes could wander and wonder. It was during those evenings that the habit of storytelling began. At first it was a single memory told to a child who asked why the lantern glass carried a pale bubble in its aqua square. Then it was a short tale set between sips of tea about the market where small things became wonders because people gave them names and placed them in the sun. Then it was the story of the clock tower light that had guided them during a night without power, and the caretaker who counted hours with his hands, and the candles that turned the town into a map of warmth. People listened and asked kind questions and offered their own small stories in return, about bread that reminded them of home, about a ship that once brought letters to loved ones waiting on the pier, about a cat that learned the timetables better than any attendant and still refused to wear a collar. On one very clear night, when the sea beyond the hill breathed a slow silver and the sky looked close enough to touch, Aiden and Mira decided to tell the whole story in gentle pieces, so that the greenhouse itself could hold it and keep it for days when the air needed a memory to warm it. They began where anyone should begin, with a cafe that kept lanterns hung low so the tables would be squares of light where faces could be seen and kindness recognized. Aiden spoke of arriving in a town that did not ask where he had been, only asked what he needed and whether he felt like sitting by the window or near the counter. He described the blue square of glass above the cafe light and how it made a small lake on the table, and how a young woman sat nearby with ferns around her like old friends keeping her company. He said he drew the light before he drew the face because the light was safer for a new hand. Mira smiled at the memory and added her side, saying that she had looked up and seen a man who watched the world without trying to hurry it, and that she had wondered whether his drawings might notice the way leaves hold breath just before a breeze arrives. She told the guests about the afternoon rain that made the awning into a small roof and the way tea tasted when shared between two people who did not yet know each other well. She described the first time he came up the hill to see the greenhouse and how he stood quietly in the center of the room and let the plants speak without translating for them. The guests sat close and listened, some on stools, some on the floor with their backs against the raised beds, some at the little table near the door where the night air could reach and cool the tea. Aiden told the part where he lost his sketchbook and found it again because Mira found it first and returned it with the steady heart of someone who knows how to care for fragile things. Mira told the part where they climbed the clock tower stairs in the dark and learned to light a town without fear by placing one small flame after another. Together they told the railway story, the night when snow delayed the only train and the station held its breath and then released it when the whistle sounded. They told the market morning when a single lantern became a keepsake because two names fit on its side without crowding, and the library afternoon when a voice reading a simple story about time standing still made a room warm enough for sleep. Then Aiden lifted the old lantern they had carried home from the mountain festival and described the lake that keeps reflections even when the wind tries to pull them away. He told how the people of the valley taught them to fold paper so it floats and to write a word that can travel without needing to be seen, and how that word can be gratitude that does not belong to one person. Mira told the part about the garden after the storm when people brought nails and hands and laughter and taught the roof how to rest on the walls again. She placed her palm on the table in that moment and the old wood warmed beneath it as if answering the memory. She talked about Aiden's bloom, the flower with petals that opened calmly like a breath trusted to return, and how the first seedling had been shy and the second had been bold, and how she had named the plant in a notebook, and yet the true name had been given by the night when the lantern touched the leaves and the leaves answered with scent. People asked questions that belonged to the kind of night it was. A small girl wanted to know whether fireflies visit the greenhouse in summer. Aiden said they do, and that fireflies enjoy reading as much as people do. An older man asked if the lantern had a favorite place to be. Mira said the lantern sometimes chose the center, sometimes chose a corner, and sometimes preferred the sill because, like any good friend, it liked to look outward and inward both. Someone asked whether the greenhouse roof ever wished to be a sky. The roof replied in its own way by reflecting starlight along a seam until a small line of brightness ran the length of the glass. Over time, these evenings grew into themselves. There were no posters or announcements. People learned to arrive around the hour when the sky did not need a name. They learned to bring small things that could be shared without fuss. A loaf from the cafe, a jar of jam with a note about the fruit that made it, a scarf that preferred a different neck and could find it on a cold night. Aiden hung a plain bell by the door for someone to ring if the path was slippery and they needed a hand. Mira kept a basket of blankets and a small tin of herbs ready for tea. The greenhouse changed in ways that made it more itself. The shelves carried more books with pressed leaves tucked inside them, remnants from a child's visit. And Aiden added a little table where people could leave a note to be read aloud by anyone who found it at dusk. The notes were simple. One thanked the night for being quiet. Another said that the waves had sounded like polite applause that afternoon. Another told of a dream in which the clock tower learned to sing. One evening the librarian brought a box with 2 sets of old fairy lights and asked whether the greenhouse would like to host a ceiling of stars. And together they threaded the lights into the rafters in modest loops so that the glass could still show the sky while the bulbs added a quiet echo. The room accepted the new stars without complaint and sometimes glowed even before the real stars arrived, which made everyone smile. Years continued to pass and to teach. The greenhouse welcomed babies who later became children who found the same stool and a book they had loved when they could barely hold it. It hosted conversations between neighbors who had grown quiet with each other and needed a place to find the tone again. It provided a corner where a traveler from a far place sat with a steaming cup and listened to a story told in a language they did not know yet understood anyway. It gave the old a familiar path and the young a reason to walk it. It gave Aiden and Mira a room where their love could be both private and shared, not because they told anyone they had what they had, but because the room made it easier to see. The small drawer at the cottage filled itself slowly with new pieces of life. There were more pressed petals, more cards with words that did not need a stamp. There was a postcard from the mountain town with a drawing of the lake in winter, mailed by the conductor who wrote that reflections change color but never stop being themselves. There was a small and beautiful letter from a child who had mispronounced Aiden's bloom as Eden's bloom and drawn a garden with a doorway that looked like a book. There was a ribbon from a lantern the valley had retired with honor after many years. There was a pencil shaving that looked exactly like a curled wave and refused to be thrown away. At home, Haven and Horizon grew even kinder. People waved through Haven and held up babies to show the window how much everyone was growing. Horizon brought in the path of moonlight with more confidence and sometimes a short sprinkle of rain for the plants near the sill. The lantern learned the room in deeper ways and sometimes drifted even before anyone touched the frame, as if the flame knew how to greet the night by itself. The painting called The Painted Moon kept its calm on the wall and returned every glance with the same message it had held on the first evening, that a thing made from love behaves best when left to be itself in the place it knows. Many guests asked for that story, and Aiden told it with modest words, because the painting did not like to be turned into a performance. Mira stood beside him when he spoke and sometimes nodded at a part that held a truth only they understood, and the guests sensed the shape of it and felt their hearts settle. On a summer evening years after the first stories began, the greenhouse offered them a gift. It was a clear night, with the kind of soft air that invites doors to remain open and with the sea speaking in tones that sounded like old promises kept. People arrived early and sat with that polite anticipation that comes when a place has a reputation for gentleness. Someone had placed fresh flowers in a jar on the small table, and someone else had stacked cups next to the kettle. Aiden lifted the greenhouse lantern to its place, and the light dialed itself into the right size for listening. The little garden outside held a hum of slow insects. The moon had not yet risen, and the stars at first looked shy and then became braver. When it grew fully dark, the fairy lights in the rafters joined the sky, and the greenhouse roof became a shallow bowl that seemed to hold the night. Mira looked at Aiden, and Aiden looked at Mira, and it felt right to begin with the simplest version of their story, the one made of small houses and slow walks and kind hands. They told how a cafe had been a beginning and a greenhouse had been a teacher and a clock tower had been a friend and a train had been a bridge and a market had been a chorus and a library had been a place where voices learned to be soft and still carry far. They told how letters can be kept and still be given, and how a lantern can become a place where thanks lives. They told how a town can turn into a home by the steady process of noticing it and being noticed in return. And then they told something new, not because it had not been true before, but because they had not said it aloud in this room. They said that love grows as a seed grows, by small measures and with help from good conditions, with warmth and time and the shelter of a wall that does not fall and the encouragement of a window that knows how to be open and how to be closed. They said that in their life together, love had been the easiest promise to keep, not because every day was simple, but because each day asked for the same few things: patience, kindness, attention, and a willingness to mend what was torn. As they spoke, a breeze passed through the open door and the lantern flame leaned and then straightened, and in that small movement they saw every hour they had spent standing side by side, and the room saw it too. A child asked what love looks like on a normal day, and Mira said it looks like putting the kettle on for someone before they notice they want tea. and it looks like washing a brush very well so it will be ready for the next page. And it looks like repotting a plant that has outgrown its container without making a speech about it. Aiden added that love sounds like a page being turned at the right moment, and like a foot placed softly on the stair, and like a laugh that knows when to rise and when to rest. An elder asked what to do when love feels quiet and unsure. And Aiden said to keep small routines, to feed the neighbor's cat, to shift the chair so it faces the window where light will arrive, to light one candle and then another. And Mira said to keep water near and to let plants show you how to bend without breaking. The questions continued, and the answers grew into a tapestry of modest advice that felt like the room itself speaking. A hush followed, a deep and friendly pause. Out beyond the greenhouse, the sea gave a patient breath, and the sky looked pleased with itself. In that hush, without any plan, Aiden reached into his pocket and drew out a very small box. He placed it on the table where everyone could see. He did not open it for a long moment because he had never cared for clever gestures or the feeling that a moment should perform. He only looked at Mira with the same gentle steadiness he had carried on the night he read the letter he had never sent. Then he opened the box and showed a ring that had been made from a thin band of silver and a tiny setting that held a sea glass chip of pale blue, the same blue that lantern glass carried, the same blue that once had rested in his palm on a morning when the beach gave them gifts. He said in a voice that did not need to be louder than the night that the ring was not a promise of something new, but a sign of what already lived between them, a steady circle, a small light. He asked Mira if she would like to wear it. She smiled with the kind of smile that had moved into his life and built a home there, and she said yes in a voice that made the greenhouse all at once feel like a person who had been waiting to hear that word. There was quiet, and then there was applause, not the kind that breaks a moment into pieces, but the kind that holds a moment in careful hands and raises it and then sets it down safely. The station attendant wiped his eyes with his sleeve and said he had a timetable that would be lovely with two names printed on the same line. And the librarian pressed a book to her chest and promised to keep a page for their story in the local history shelf. The widow at the market nodded like a gardener who recognizes a good blossom. The boy without red mittens, now taller and wise in his own ways, drew the greenhouse and the stars on the back of a recipe and handed it to the couple with a grin that still carried a trace of the child who once counted pains. Aiden placed the ring on Myra's finger, and it looked exactly right, like a color that had been in the room all along and only needed someone to point to it and say, "Look." They did not celebrate with noise. They celebrated by making tea for everyone present and by turning the lantern a little so the light would fall on each guest's face in turn, and by opening the door so the night could come in and carry the good news to the hill. When the gathering ended and footsteps made gentle sounds going down the path and the last cup was rinsed and set to dry, they stayed behind a while. They stood under the glass roof with the fairy lights above them and the true stars beyond that and the scent of herbs and warm water in the air. They remembered the cafe and the notices on the board and the soft rain under the awning and the market of small wonders and the clock tower and the train and the lake and the lanterns and the letters never sent and at last sent and received all the same. They remembered the cottage with its 2 windows that watched them learn how to be together and the way the town had made a place for them at the table without asking for anything other than that they be themselves. They looked at their hands and at the ring that now lived on Mira's finger and understood that all along their life had been practicing how to make this night, and that the practice would continue the next morning and the next. They cleaned the room with an ease that comes from many evenings done well, closing the windows and lowering the lantern and touching the door with a soft palm that told the wood to rest. On the path home, a few fireflies lifted and put down their lights as if trying on the idea of dawn. The sea had quieted to a gentle hush that carried a suggestion of song. At the cottage door they paused and looked through haven and saw the square asleep and through horizon and saw the calm line where sky and water meet. Inside the lantern learned their breath as always and found its balance, and the ring reflected a small star into the aqua pane and made the bubble glow. They set the festival lantern beside it, and the 2 lights agreed without words. Before sleep they opened the drawer where their pieces of life lived and placed inside a folded card that Aiden wrote in the simplest words he knew. It said, "Thank you for growing with me." Mira added a pressed petal from Aiden's bloom and a square of paper with the date. And then they closed the drawer and went to the small room where the quilt had learned their shape. The night held them the way a good story holds its last line without squeezing it, and morning promised to arrive with fresh bread and a friend at the door and a small task waiting and another evening soon when the greenhouse would open its arms and the stars would come to listen. The years ahead did not feel like a series of events, but like the steady turning of pages in a book that is being read with care. When people asked them how to tend love, they kept saying the same things: hold it gently, feed it well, give it light and time, mend what is torn, listen more than you speak, let every window face a world and still look into each other. The town nodded and agreed because the town had seen it. The sea made its endless path and offered a whisper that became a song only when someone leaned in very close. Aiden and Mira leaned in again and again, and learned the song and taught it in small ways to anyone who visited the Garden of Stars, the place where plants glow under a roof that remembers every night, where stories are told in voices that help a room fall into a calm sleep, and where 2 people who once met across a square of lantern light have built a life that teaches the simple truth they discovered long ago, that love, like a seed, grows quietly when given warmth and time, and then one day the room you have tended lights itself and the stars seem to nod, and you understand you are home.